started with our objects. We talked about the basic stuff there. We talked about the structuring of array, and at the same time, we talked about some of these what we call the static method. We're going to know what is static when we go to the class. They're like that. But on this object, which is a class that is given to us by JavaScript, we're going to see how to create our own tool later on when we get to the OOP, and how you too can create your own static method. So we talked about this from entries, which allows you to convert any iterable data into objects. So, and we use array to demonstrate this thing, but it's not only array that you can use. You can deal with set later on, or you can use map when we get there. So we talked about all this one. So you can convert them to objects, or you can convert from that object to map or to the other type that we have there. So this is not the only method or the static method that we have on the object. There is still other one that I'm going to bring in later on. But for now, I want to talk about this keyword in JavaScript. So I want to talk about this keyword because the thing is kind of crazy, and it's something that you need to know about when you are dealing with advanced JavaScript dev. So, and normally where you'll be using it is when you are dealing with class, or when you are dealing with objects, or when you are dealing with methods. So that's the place where you always use this keyword. And the way it works is unlike the other programming language that it always static there. So if you use it in the object or in the class or the method, the way whatever it is giving you in one place, that's what is always going to give you everywhere. But the way it works in JavaScript is quite different. So the way this work is depending on where it's being called, and where you are defining it. So depending on where you define it or where it's being called, will determine the value is going to hold. And it doesn't hold one value every time. And you can even change it by talking to your object or wherever you're using it, that no, this is not the value that this thing is going to hold. This is another value that you want to give to it, like that. And what's the usefulness of this? So in objects, when you're dealing with objects, we use this keyword to revert to the objects that you are currently working on. For example, here now, I have this object here, which have the first name, the last name, the level, the languages, the teacher, method 1, method 2, method 3, and so forth, like that. So from this method, and what is method? By now you know what is that, which is a function that is defined inside object or class. So any function that is defined inside class or object, they are referred to as method. So here now I have 5 of them, which I present how you can define them. So this is one way of defining your method, by using the key and the value, because function too, they are just value. So you can assign them to a key, and anytime you call this key, it's going to perform whatever you have in front of it. So this is one way of defining method inside objects.
Sorry, I
Or
cannot see your screen again. Yes.
a all right, so just like what I was saying there, a method is just a function that you have inside your um object or method, object or class there. So, and how do you define it? These are different ways of defining method inside object. So we can use can use this pattern, which is where you have the key and you set a function in front of it, just like the way you do your normal property inside object. Another one, which is the shorthand there, the shorthand property, or the way of doing it in a short form, is by using this method 2 here. So this method 2 and method 1, they are the same thing. There is no difference between them. But just that this second one is shorter compared to this first one that we have there. So you can do it like this, or you can do it like this. And the last one, which is this arrow. But this one is kind of crazy there, based on what I want to explain to this. Because the way this work, this is the stuff we want to talk about. This is the property we want to talk about. This. And the way this thing is going to come out, or whatever it is going to give you, is depending on where you are using it, whether you are using it inside object or you are using it inside the method of the object. So the way it's going to work, or where you're using inside class, the way it's going to work is depending on where you are using it and how it's being called. That's the reason I want to explain this stuff, because when you want to deal with JavaScript advanced stuff, you need to know about this here. And we have this method one, we have this method two, three, and these other two methods that I want to use to access what is inside this object. So we have this object with this property and along with this method. But inside one of this method here, which is this print full name, I want anytime this function is called on this object, I want it to print this my first name and the last name are for me. So here, how do you have access to the property of the object that you are working on? So this method now needs to have access to everything that is inside this object. And how do you have access to it? You can use this keyword that we have in JavaScript. But the way this work is depending on where you are using the stuff. So first, let's start with the basic one, which is how does this thing work when you are dealing with normal function or when you are dealing with arrow function? Because the way it works in arrow function is different from the way it works in normal function. So what is normal function? These are functions that you define in this way. Whether you do it in this way or you use this method 2 here, they are referred to as a normal function. And you know this third one here, which is this method 3, we're using arrow function. So when you do it this way, this is arrow function or arrow method, and these other two, they are just normal method inside a object. Hope my screen is still showing. Please let me know when the thing is not showing again.
Yes, I see sure.
Okay. So anytime you use this inside a method, anytime you use this inside the normal method, so whatever object that call this method, that's what this keyword is referring to. So anytime you call this method, whatever object that call this method, that's what this is going to revert to. So when you are using this keyword inside method of any object, so the object that actually call this method is what this thing is going to represent. And what do I mean by that? So here the object is user, followed by dot, and followed by this method one here. So which object is calling this method? Which object is calling the method is whatever you have on the left side of the dot. So whatever you have on the left side of the dot, that's what this is going to correspond to. Let me scroll up so that I can align the stuff. So anytime you are calling a method on your object, so this is the object and this is the method that we are calling. And inside this method here, we are calling this stuff. So we are calling this stuff. So anytime you are using this inside any method, which is normal function, I'm talking about normal function right now. Anytime you are using this inside a method of any object, the object that you have beside it, that means the one that comes before the dot, that's what this thing is referring to inside that method. So which means when this thing is called now, what is going to console logger for this stuff is the entire object that actually calls this method. Anytime you are using this inside any normal method of a particular object, that object that you are having before the dot, that's what this thing is referring to. Please, anytime you are using method, the normal method, I'm not talking about arrow right now. So anytime I say method and I did not specify the one that I'm talking about the normal method. But anytime I want to talk about arrow, I'm going to add arrow to the method. So anytime you are dealing with method in your object, whatever object that comes before the dot, that's what this thing is referring to. So which means if I save this thing now and call the method, you are going to see that in the console, what do I have there? Data. Where did I use data? Online. What is that? Line 46. 46. Why am I using data? Oh, once comment it out. Don't have data again. All right. Let's go back to where we are. That one is here. Previous class. Yeah. So as you can see now, so the method now, this is what is giving us as the value of this. So the value of this thing here is going to be whatever the object that it's calling that method. Because this thing you can use, even though it's defined inside user, we can use it with another object later on. It will still work and it will be referring to that object. And that's what I'm saying, that whatever object that is calling the method, that's the one that owns this here, or the value of this is going to be whatever the object that calls the method. So here now, since user is the one that is calling this method, or is the one on the left side of the dot, then the value of this inside that method is going to be that object. And that's the reason why you see that we are getting all the value back here. Anytime you are using this inside a normal function, which is inside your object, whatever object that you have on the left side of it, that's the one that this is referring to. So since you know that this method now is going to be called on this particular object, then from there you can use it to have access to anything that is inside that particular object. Because you know that when this thing is called on a particular object, you can have access to everything that is inside that particular object. And that's what we can use with this print full name here. Because what I want to use here is that I want to be able to print the first name and the last name here. So instead of me just coming here by just saying console then log like this, so let me, so here we can just do, because this one too will work, but this is a bad practice. So first name, because what if the name change later on? Not user again, it's not something else. So you don't do it like this, but this one too will work. Then last name like this. So what we are doing here is that anytime this function is called, we want to print out the first name and the last name, which is going to give us our full name. So which means here now I can use my user then dot print, so print full name like this, and we are going to have the results that we are expecting there, because it will look for this particular value, which is going to be user. And as you can see here, we are getting the full name. So I have the text that I'm printing at the top, and at the same time I'm printing the first name and the last name of the particular object that I pass it. But this is a bad practice, because what we want to access is this same object here. But through its method, you can actually have access to everything that is inside it by using this. Because you know that anytime you call this particular function on that object, this will revert to whatever you have on the left side of the dot. So whatever stuff you have on the left side of the dot, whatever object you have on the left side of the dot, that's what this thing is going to revert to. So which means this or this user here, they are the same thing. But this one is more appropriate compared to you using the name of the variable for that object. Because this thing here, no matter what name you use for it, this thing will always revert to that particular object. Or if this thing change later on to anything, this will always revert to that object that calls the method, not the name. Because this one now, if the name change, this one is going to create a problem. Or if it's being called somewhere else that or you change user to something before this one is called, it's going to create a problem too. Or you change it to another object, you are going to be seeing something from that object directly there, because the name has changed and it's not what you are expecting the stuff to give you. So when you are dealing with object and you need to access its property inside the method that you define inside that particular object there, what you always use is this here. And this is corresponding to, I'm not saying is this user here, it's corresponding to whatever you use to call this method. Whatever object you use to call this method, that's what this is going to revert to. Because the value of this thing here is depending on how it's being used and where it's being called. So when you are dealing with your normal function that you have inside object, so that function, we have access to everything that the object that is calling it. And which object is it calling this print name now? It is the user that we have by this side. Because later on you can have other objects that will borrow the method from this one here. Or you can even have this method outside. For example, here now, we can have this thing outside of the of this object there. It doesn't need to be inside. It can be outside too, and it will still work. For example, here now, we can have print uh, full name like this, but this one is going to be 2. And inside it, what do we want to print? We want to do the same thing. So the same thing that I did here is what I want to do outside here too, and it's still going to work. So it's still going to work. So let me put my function here. So down here, instead of calling this one, what we can actually do is to call this print 2 like this. But it's not on it, so we need to assign it first so that it can work the way we want it to be. So what I can just do here is to just print 2 is the same thing as whatever the print 2 that I define outside here. That's the reason why most of the time you always create it inside the object directly instead of creating it outside here. But this one too will still work like this. So on this user, we are assigning print2. And from there, anytime I call this print2 here, then it will look for whatever object that call it. And that object is what this is going to revert to there like that. So let me see what this thing is telling me. Yeah, this one is just TypeScript stuff. So property 2 minus, so I've created it already, so it doesn't need to shout. So here now, this thing here is going to work. Or if I want to, instead of assigning it to user, I can assign it to another object that have this same property. And you see that it's going to do what I'm expecting it to do there. But I will come back into this one later on because there's some other thing that we need to do, or that I want to use this one to explain. But the major thing here is that anytime you are using this inside a method or inside a function, that function or the value of this inside the function, it's going to correspond to the object that call it. So if you have a method inside a particular object and you are using this inside it, so the value of this thing here is going to be the object that calls it. So if you have this user now and we call it here, since we are calling this print full name on the user, then it's going to replace this with whatever that object is, which is this user. So which means here now it will remove this and it will replace it with the value that we have inside this place. And that's the reason why we are having this full name here. But what is now the advantage of this thing? One of the advantages is that you don't need to care about the name of the object that you are using. This will always revert to that object, whether the name is user or is something else or whatever you want to call it. So here now, if I just change it to user one, so where I want to call it here, I need to update it to user one because there is nothing like a user again. But there is a problem. There is a problem. So if I save this thing now, there is somewhere that we are still using user. We did not change it, or we forgot to change it because this one now there is no more user. Now if you run the code now, you see that this thing is going to give us a problem. And as you can see, it's giving us that user is not defined. So the problem is from here. But assuming I'm not using this name, I use this directly. This thing will never cause a problem. It doesn't care about the name of your object. As long as you are passing that object, or that object is always on the left side, or whatever you use, whatever object you use on the left side, that's what is always going to revert to. It doesn't care about the name that you're using. The only thing it care about is which object are you using on the left. Once it sees that object, that's what it's going to use as the value of this keyword here. And that's how it work normally when you are dealing with a normal function that is inside object. This is how it works when you are dealing with a normal function that is inside object. But when you are dealing with arrow function, it doesn't work like that. The way it works in arrow is quite different. For example, here now, let me call the arrow function, and you see that it will not give us the same thing. So here, I'm using this user one, then this method 3 here. So calling this one now, the value of this will never be this object that you're using it. So it doesn't take the value from the object that is calling it. It takes the value of this from somewhere else, which is something I will get back to. As you can see now, can you see what is giving us? The value is different. When you call method 2, when you call method 1, that is normal function. If you call method 1, that is normal function, you see that the value of this inside it will be the object that calls that stuff. As you can see, the value of the this inside it is the object that calls it. But if it is arrow function, it doesn't work like that. The arrow function doesn't take the value of the object that define it. It takes the value of the environment of where it's being called, which I'm going to explain more of it when we get to the class side there. Because here now, if you look at it, this arrow function now, it doesn't deal with any object where you define it. it always work based on the function where it's being called. So this method here now, is it being defined inside any function? No, it's only being defined inside object. And since it's being defined inside object, it will look at where it's being called. So where this thing is being called, is this thing inside any function? No. Where is defined, is it inside that function? Is it inside any function there? No. So it will be using what we call the global object. This is the global object there, which is window. But I don't want to explain this arrow right now because it's kind of a complex, but I will get into it once we are talking about the class there, because that one it will be more clearer there. But when you are using arrow, when you are using arrow with your object, you can't use this. It doesn't work. It will never give you the value of the object that calls it. If you need the value of the object that calls it when you are using this keyword, all right. So when you are dealing with objects and that object is having method, the only method that will give you the value of this as that object that calls it is the normal function. So when you're dealing with normal function, anytime you use this inside it by default, it's going to give you the object that calls it, because you can actually change it later on, because the value of this is always like it's dynamic, something that you can change, and it can even change on its own too, depending on who is calling it and where it's being called. So when you have object and that object inside you have a normal method or normal function, and you want to reference that particular object, the property that's inside, you want to reference something from that object, you can use this, because this will always revert to the value of the object that you're using to call that method. And you know this method now is only available on this object, even though you can still use it outside of it. But right now, let's just assume it is on this object. And since the object that you're going to use to call it like this, then it's always going to, the value of this will always be whatever that object I use to call that method. So by the time the thing is running and JavaScript get to this here, then to look at it, which object calls the method. So and is it normal method? If it is normal method, then this now will revert to that object that calls it. So which means this now you can use it to access anything that is inside that object, because I know that that's what I want to use to access or that's what I want to use to call my method. But don't forget, it doesn't work like that when you are dealing with arrow function. Arrow function doesn't know anything about this. What it's going to do is that anytime you call this inside the arrow function, it will look at its surrounding function there, surrounding normal function. Anytime you call um arrow function there, anytime you're using arrow function, what it will do is that it will look around it. Which function is it surrounding my calling? So where you are calling this arrow function, which function is it surrounding it? So the function that is surrounding it, the value of this there is what it's going to take. And if you look at where we are calling the arrow function, we are not surrounding it with anything. Where it's being defined to is not being wrapped in any other function. So since it's not being wrapped in any other function, then what is going to look for is the global this, because this can assume any value. It can be undefined, it can be the global one, and on the browser, the global this is just the window. So anytime you are using this and the context that you are working on is from the global there, this is what you are going to get as the value. But when you are using normal function on your object instead of this arrow function, then the value of that particular this inside the function or inside the method is going to be the object that you have on the left side of it. When you're dealing with arrow, it doesn't work like that. But when you're dealing with normal function, this is how it works. So whatever object that calls that method, that's what this is going to revert to. Even though both of them are coming from this object, this inside normal function is referring to the object. If you call it like this, the way we are doing it like this. But if you use arrow, it doesn't get the value of the object that owns it. The way it works is depending on its surrounding function where you define it. So whatever function where this thing is being defined here, the this inside it, that's what it's going to take. And you're going to see this in when we are dealing with a constructor function later on, or when we are dealing with class. That's where you're going to see the arrow function. And that's the reason why you see that anytime you are using set timeout or you are using set interval, what you always use here is arrow function, because the value of this is not depending on that set timeout or is not depending on the set interval. It's depending on where you are calling that set timeout. That's what is going to use as the value of this. If you use normal function inside that your set timeout or set interval, you see that it will not give you what you're expecting, because the way normal function work is different from the way arrow works. And we're going to see all this in action later on when we get to class there. But just know that when you are dealing with a normal method inside your object, the value of this is referred to the object that calls it, that call it. Because just because you are using this in somewhere else and you are not calling it, it will still not work. We are going to see that one too as soon. But right now, we are calling this our function. And since this our function or this method that we're calling here is defined on this user one, and this user one is the object. So that means the value of this will now revert to that object that calls it. The object is calling it right now, because later on you can add something like this where you assign this function now to another variable. Here we are not calling it, we are just assigning the stuff into another variable. So here too it will not work, and I will explain what is going on there, because here now you are not calling it, you are just assigning it to another variable. So since you did not call it, you just assign, then this thing too will not work again. This will not work again, because when you are now calling this thing later on, when you call the f, do you use anything beside it? If you look at this f now, you see there is no dot and there is no object beside it. So this, since there is no object and there is no dot there, then these two will not work the way you are expecting it to work. And that's the reason why I'm saying that whatever object that is beside the dot, whatever object you have on the left, that's the value of this in NEPA. So where the value, I'm coming, my screen will change because NEPA just took my light. So the other monitor has off. Let me pause this. All right. So anytime you see any code that is using this, the first thing you need to ask yourself is which object is it calling that method. So whatever object you have on the left side of the dot, that's what the value of this is going to revert to there. And since we are calling, don't let me call this one yet. Don't let me call this f yet. I will get back into this one. So once we save it now, you see that inside that method one, the value of this is going to revert to the object. And that's the reason why we are able to access the first name and the last name. Because by the time we call this print full name on this object here, it will see that we are using this object to call it, which is this one here, the user one. So since we are calling this print full name on this user, so that means user one now is what this is going to revert to. And you know that inside user one, we have first name, we have last name, and we have some other value. So since we have first name and last name, then it's going to give us the first name that is inside it, and at the same time, it's going to give us the last name that we have inside the stuff, which is what we can do here too for this print level and language. So if I want to print the level, but I'm not getting the value from outside, I still want to print the level that is inside this particular object. What do we need to do? What we just need to do is to use the this, and this is going to give us access to the object. And you know that on this object we have all this property. As you can see, it's showing already here, but it doesn't work like that inside arrow. Anytime you want to use this in your object, always make sure that you are using normal function, not arrow. Anytime you are dealing with object and you want to use this to revert to that particular object that will be calling this method later on, always use normal function. Don't use arrow, because arrow will not give you what you're expecting there. Arrow will always give you the global one, and you cannot change it. You cannot change what is inside arrow. You can change the normal function on, but you cannot change the arrow function. We are going to see how to change this one later on when we get to this particular f here. But for now, whatever object that calls it, that's what the value of this thing is going to be. And since we know that this is going to be our object, then from there what we can just do here is to this dot level, or we can just add some text into it. Your level is this, and the at language at index, which index, So at index language index like this is this. So we need to do this one too. So this dot language and pass whatever the language index, because we need to pick whatever language we want, even though this code is not reliable. Because if the user supplies something that is outside, because right now how many language do I have? One, two, three, four. So which means you can't supply more than three there. So I'm not checking that for now. So here we have this function here where it can print your level and at the same time the particular language that you want to uh, print out from the list of these languages that I have here. So I have this array of languages: HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and TypeScript. And in order for this thing to work the way we're expecting it to work there, what we need to do, we need to call it on the object. So the user user one, then we have this print language, which I can just call. And if you notice, I supply this default stuff that we talked about before, the default parameter, which means if you are not supplying this language index, we are using zero by default. And if this thing is called now, we should have the correct stuff printed out, which is this: your level is 800 and the language at index 0 is HTML. And if I want any language at any particular index, I can just pass the index and it's going to print the language at that particular index here like that. So, and as you can see on the object, it's having access to the internal stuff that we have inside that particular object. So when you have your object and you have the methods that can act on top of the data that you have inside that your object, what you use is this keyword. And this keyword will have access to everything that is inside of that object, if and only if the object is calling the method like this. The only time it will work if your object is calling the method directly, not that you are assigning it to another variable. Like this one now, it will not work. It will not give us the value of this. The same thing here too. We can assign this one by just say that const g is going to be user one, then dot print level like this. So print language, whatever stuff. This one too will not work the way we are expecting it to be, because the object is not calling the method. It's only assign it to another variable. And when you now want to call that variable, as you can see now, the object is not being called beside it. And since the object is not being called beside it, then the value of this is going to be something else. And what is it going to be? It's going to be the global object. Anytime you use the method of your object like this, anytime you use the method of your object like this, it will never give you what you are expecting. Anytime you assign or anytime you are using the method of object, or you assign it to another variable, or you are passing it to as a callback to your set timeout or set interval or anything there, it will never work again the way you're expecting it to work. Because the only time it will work is when the object is calling that method directly. If the object is not calling the method, it will not work. And the only time the object will call the method is when this bracket is there. That's the only time you are calling method. But if you don't call this, you don't do it like this, what you are just doing is you are assigning it to a variable. You are not calling it here. And the only time you are calling it is this f here, because this f now, you are saying is representing this particular method one that is coming from user. But when you are calling it, because the only time this will check, the only time the value of this thing will be set is when you are calling it. And the only time we are calling this one now is on this line that we are calling f. But do we use any object beside it? No. And since we did not use any object beside it, then it will not give us, as you can see now, it's calling that method one. When you call the method one normally, so when you call the method one normally like this, you are going to get what you're expecting. So it's going to call the method one, and at the same time, the object or the value of this is going to revert to whatever object that calls it. But when you assign that method to another variable, it doesn't work again, because the time you'll be calling it, there is no object beside the variable. And since there is no object beside the variable, then the value of this is not going to be global. As you can see, it's calling the same method, but the value of this is different. So anytime you are working with your objects, inside the object you have the method, and inside the method you are using this here. You need to be careful on how you are calling the method. If it is normal method, if it has arrow method, just know that it will not even give you the value of the object when you call it on itself. If you call arrow on the object, it will never give you what you be expecting there, because where you define this in, the way arrow works is depending on the surrounding function that define it. And if you look at it now, there is no function here. This user now is not defining inside any function. And since it's not defining inside any function, it's defined globally, like your script. It's defined directly in your script. And since it's defined directly in your script, then this will be referring to global object. Again, when you are dealing with normal function, when you call that normal function on your object, the object will now be this keyword. And again, if you assign that your method to another variable, that one too will not work, because the method that you are now calling now is not using that your object again. And since it's not using that your object, or the object is not even anywhere beside it, then the value of this too is going to revert to the global object. So which means this G now, if you call it, we are not going to get what we are expecting. Even if I pass the index or if I don't pass the index, if you call it now, you see that what we'll be getting there is just going to be undefined. Like that. As you can see now, let me save it self. Let me save it. It's even giving an error because it's trying to look for language, but there's nothing like language there. So reading as zero of this language there, because on the method we are looking for this index, particular index, or this language here. But this, since we are calling it, or since we have already assigned this into another variable, and there is nothing beside it, there is no dot, you can't do something like this. There is no way you can do something like this. It's not possible, because this is a variable on its own and it's not defined on user one. So if you call it, it will not work, because we're looking for this G on user one, and we don't have anything like that. As you can see, we don't have anything like that. So you have to call it normally, because it's a normal variable. And if you call it like this, there is no user there again, or there is no object beside it. And since there is no offset, the object beside it, then the value of this now is going to revert to the global object. And that's what I use this one to explain here. Anytime you are working with object, and on the method of that object, you assign it to a variable, that your method is going to lose the value of this, which means whatever the value that this is supposed to be, which is this object before, it will now be referring to the global object, or wherever this function is being called. Any of the value for this, or where this function is being called, that's what this thing is going to revert to. And that's the reason why this one is not working again, because we are not calling it directly on the user, we assign it to another variable, and it's not that variable that will call. So since we call that variable, this variable doesn't have access to what is coming from the user, because they are not the same thing. And since they are not the same thing again, then this will now revert to the global object. And that's the reason why you see that it's showing global. But on the global, as you can see, we don't have anything like first name there. We don't have anything like last name, or we don't have anything like level on languages, which is something you can actually set on the global if you want to do it. If you want it to work now, what you have to do is to do window, then dot, because you can put anything on it, it's going to be this, which I can just put testing like this. So if I save it and run it now, we should be able to see the stuff. As you can see that it's now working. So because it's looking for these languages on the global object, and the global object is window. So the global object is window at the time this G is being called. Before this thing will work, you have to call it directly on the object where you want the value of this to represent. Any object that called the stuff is what this is going to represent. But if you are not calling it, you are assigning it to another variable, then the value of this will now revert to global object. So which means whatever you are accessing on this here, it will be looking for it inside the global object. And if it's not available, then you get error. If it's something that can cause error, if the one that cannot cause error, you will just see that it's not showing at all. As you can see here, the level, the first language, and we are getting error because we are trying to read zero on these particular languages here, and we don't have anything like that on the window, so it will give us error. But there is a way of solving this problem. Because there's a lot of time you want to do something like this. There's a lot of time you want to assign something like this to a variable, and from there you can actually talk to JavaScript that anytime this stuff is called, this is the value that you want this thing to use as this. I hope you are still here.
Yes, sir.
All right. So the anytime you are doing something like this, you can actually talk to JavaScript that anytime this your stuff is called somewhere, this is what is going to be the value of this. And if you check a lot of code, but I've been seeing something like this known as a bind. So this is what you can use to bind the value of this. So what you can do here is that whatever you pass, the first argument you are going to pass here is whatever JavaScript is going to use later on as the value of this when this G is called. So when this G now is called, what do you want to use as the value of this? That's what this bind is there for. If you don't put the bind by default, it's going to use the context of where this your G is being called. So since the G is being called in a global script here, then the value of this is going to be this window. But what if I don't want this thing to use window? I still want it to be using user there, like this one currently now. If I call this F, what you are going to see is that is using window as the value of this. But we can talk to this method that even though we are not calling you directly on this user, we are using this F to call you. We want you to bind to this particular this. And whatever you pass as the first argument to this is what JavaScript is going to use as the value of this thing here. So whatever you pass into bind is what JavaScript is going to use as the value of this. So for example here now, I can just pass empty object here, and this empty object is going to have first name, or is just going to have name as a raster like this. So what I'm saying here is that anytime we call this F, the value of this that is being used inside this method is going to be whatever I pass here. So whatever object you pass here. So if I save it now, you see that this thing is not going to be global again, and is now what I pass in. So the value of this can change. You can change it yourself by using bind. So when you call the function directly on the method, it's going to, or when you call the method directly on the object, it's going to use this object direct by default on the bind. You don't need to do it. When you call the object like this, when you call the method on the object like this, it's going to bind to whatever you have on the left on the dot. But when you are using it as a value to another variable, it will lose the context of this object here. Because if you don't pass this in now, once you do it like this, it doesn't know that it's coming from this object again. Even though it's going to use that function, wherever you are now calling the stuff, that's what is going to be the context of the this that you are calling. But if you don't want it to do like that, you can talk to it. Okay, later on, when this F is being called, the value you are going to use for this is whatever the user pass here. So yet now, if I call it again, you see that the value we are now getting is this particular stuff that I pass in. Let me comment on this one so that it doesn't get confused. So the value of this inside F when it's being called later on is not going to be name. So if you want the scene to still be this user, instead of you passing your own custom stuff here, what you can just do is this user one. And that's what this thing is doing behind the scene. This is what this thing is going to do behind the scene. So when this one is method is called on this, it's going to bind this object directly on it in this way. But if you are now assigning it to another variable, you have to do it yourself. JavaScript will not do it. You have to be the one that will bind. And this one said it's flexible because you can bind it to any object. And that's the reason why I bind it to that object that have only name. Anything you bind here, that's what F will be using as the value of this anytime this method is called. So this is what we call function binding. And you always do this thing anytime you are assigning a variable or anytime you are assigning method to a variable. So whatever value that you are doing there, this will now revert to what you bind with that method. And that's what we can do here too. So if you want this method now, or this G to still be reverting to this user, what we have to do here is to use bind. And whatever you pass here, that's what is going to use as the object for the value of this inside this function. Look at this function here, which is this print level and language. We are assigning it to this variable. Without this bind, this variable here or this method here will lose the context of this. So which means it will not be reverting to this user again when it's being called. It will be global object or where this G is being used. Whatever D is there, that's what it's going to pick up. But you don't want it to be like that. You still want it to use whatever you have on this object. So you need to bind. And using this bind now, you can pass whatever object as the first argument. But I see other thing you can pass to it in case if this method is requesting for a argument. Because here now, if you look at this thing now, it's expecting one argument there. So you can pass it directly under this G, or you can even supply the stuff directly where you are doing the binding. So here, you can actually pass the arguments that you want to pass into this thing. And what this thing is saying is that we are binding this print level to this user. And anytime it is called, the argument we are supplying is 0. But I will not be doing it like this. I will just pass it directly because you can actually do it in this place too. So pass 1. And when this thing is called now, when G is called, anytime this print level is being used, as you can see, whatever will pass as a bind, that's what is going to use as a value of this. If I want, I can replace it with another object. And this is the power of JavaScript here. If I want, I can change it to another thing by changing the level to maybe 2, then languages here. So languages here is just going to be Yoruba like this. And you know that I can index string too. So which means when this thing is low now, what is going to give us as a language is going to be O now. And if I save it, you see that it's still working, even though we are passing another thing entirely to it. So this is how JavaScript, this is the crazy stuff about JavaScript. The value of this is going to be depending on how this function is being called. So how this function is being called or where it's being used. So when you call the method directly on the object that define it, that object is what JavaScript is going to bind as the value of this. But when you assign it to a variable, it will lose the that context. It doesn't know about the object again. And since it doesn't know about the object, when you call the stuff, it will not know the value of this. And since it doesn't know that object to be using the global context, which means if I remove this bind that we have here, by the time this thing is called, by the time this G1 is called, it will seal our this level language index as 1. But by the time it get inside, it will look for this. And this is global. So it will look for level on global, and at the same time, it will look for languages on the global context. But there's nothing like that on global context, and as you can see, it's throwing error. But if you want this thing to still work based on whatever object you supply into it, then you can now bind it. So whatever you bind here is what JavaScript is going to use as the value of this when you assign that method to another variable that you want to call somewhere later on. If you don't do it like this, the value of this is going to take wherever this thing is being called. And currently here we are calling it in our script. We are not calling it inside any function. So it's going to revert to as the global context. But if I call it maybe this function too, I call it inside another function, and that function have its own context for this. That's what it's going to use. But since we are calling it globally here, that's why it's going to use global object if I don't bind the stuff like this. So when you are dealing with method that is inside your object, that method we have access to this, and this, if the object is calling the method directly, this is referring to that object. But if that object is not calling the method directly, you are assigning it to another variable, it will lose that context. And since it's losing that context, you have to be the one that will do the binding. And how do you bind? So before you assign, you bind it, and inside this bind, you supply the object that you want JavaScript to use for the value of this when the stuff is running. So when this variable is called as a function, so what do you want to use as a value of this inside this function here? And that's whatever you pass inside it, that's what it's going to do. And as you can see here now, the same function here, look at how it's coming out. If I pass the user 1, it's going to do something else because they are different objects, but they have the same interface because I'm passing the same language, but the data is different, but it's the same key. And since the key and the interface are okay, then it will work. Whether I pass user 1 or I'm passing another object here. And this is how this work inside object. When you're dealing with object, anywhere you see this, look at where this method is being called. Is it being called directly on that object? If it is being called directly on that object, just know that the value of this is referring to that particular object. But if the thing is not being called directly, it's being used as a value to another variable, or is being passed as callback to another function, it will not work the way you're expecting it to work. It will never work because the value of this will be representing the context of where that thing is being called. And this thing is really popular when you're dealing with array. This thing is actually on the array, just that you don't really use it like that because most of the uh function or whatever stuff you want to pass into all this your higher function there, what you always do is to pass the arrow, and it's because arrow there you are not using this. Most of them you don't need to use this because array is giving you the value, but you can actually specify a context or this argument to any of this your array stuff. For example, here now we can use this filter, and on it, as you can see, the last argument that you can supply there is known as this. So what this thing is doing is that anytime you're using any this inside this your filter or inside the function that you pass inside it, what is the value of this that you want to use? So that's what this thing is there. But most of the time you don't really need it. What you need is to pass the function that you want to run, and once you pass the function, at the end of it, what do you want to use as the value of this? So inside this thing now, I want this thing to use my user as a value of this. So when it means anytime this your filter is called, inside it, when you are doing anything like this dot whatever stuff, it will give you this user one as the value of this. So all this your array method, all of most of them, they have this argument. So what do you want to pass? You can think of this argument as what we are doing on this line, which is bind. So you can, this one now is going to bind this user to whatever function that you pass into this your filter later on, and inside it you can do anything like this dot whatever stuff. This now is representing this object that you send down here, and this is where it's coming from here. So this, the way it works is depending on where it's being called. So if you call it directly on the object like this, you call your method, which is a normal function, not arrow function. If you call it directly like this on your object, the value of this inside that method is just going to be this object. But once you assign it to another variable like this, it will lose that context. So it doesn't know about this user one again. So in order for it to know about the user one or any other object that you want this thing to represent as this here, just bind it. And anytime you call this G later on, the way you are calling this function, that's what the way you call this G too. Just that you assign it. So the way we are supposed to call this print level and this stuff, which is it's expecting this one particular parameter here, that's the same way you are going to call G. The difference between them is that this one now, it will lose its context anytime you assign it to that variable. But if you call it directly, it knows about the stuff, about the object that calls it. But once you do it like this, it doesn't know about the object again because it's not the object that is calling the G. The G is being called directly. So you need to bind this stuff so that you'll be able to have access to this or to the value that you're expecting this thing to have. Because the way this thing works is depending on where it's being used and where it's being called. So if you call it like this, it will work the way you're expecting it to work. It will give you the object that owns the stuff. But if it is like this, it doesn't work. You have to pass or you have to bind whatever object that you want this thing to use as this inside it. And once you pass the object, and that object is what is going to represent the value of this anytime the function is being called later on there like this. So this is this keyword. This is not all about it, but this is just a sample. But we are going to be using this in a lot later on, most especially when we are dealing with the getter and the setter in your object or in your class later on, or when you want to create or when you want to have access to the object property inside its method. So you need to use this in. But what you need to be careful of is that when you are assigning it to a variable, it will lose that context that you're expecting it to be giving you. So you need to bind it back so that it work the way it's supposed to work. And assuming you started using React when React was using class component, this is what you always do there and there. But these days, React is using functional component. But that doesn't mean you'll still not be using this keyword. You're still going to use it anytime you want to build a centralized system where you have like a class later on that you put all the thing that is related to that functionality that you want to do are there. And when we are done with class, I will be showing you this one later on. As you can see here, there's a particular project I work on which have a storage service. But I don't just want to be using local storage or season storage directly where I need it. I created a class. But this class, it have a lot of things under it. And under it there, I can have access to whatever that is going on within that class. And you are going to be using something like this and a lot of other things related to this argument here like that. And that's why I'm explaining it on this object. So that by the time we get to the class or where you'll be seeing it in some other code base, because when you are working or when you're even working some UI library later on, you need to go and check their code to see what they are doing behind the scene there. so that you too you can know what you need to do or to replicate that stuff to build something on your own too. And when you started seeing some of this thing in their code, it will not look strange like what is this thing doing here, or what is it going to be the value of this thing, and so forth, uh like that there. So your object can have a method, and inside the method, that method can have access to the object that calls it. And what do you use? You are going to use this. And the only time it will work like that is when first you are using normal function, not arrow function. And again too, the object, it's calling the method directly, not that you are assigning it to another variable or you are passing it as callback. If you pass this thing as callback to something like theta or any other function that is expecting another function as parameter, they will lose the context. You can now set the context back based on whatever that method is expecting from you. For example, here now, look at this function here. So I declare this function run. So this thing is expecting a function that you want to run. And what is it going to do? It will just call the function. But now, if you try it with what we have at the top here, so if you try with this user now, so on this user, what do we want to do? We just want to use this run, and we are passing this user one, then dot what do we want to pass into it? We want to pass this print full name like that. So you are not to call it, you are just to pass the function. So it will not be the one that will call it. But this one now, as you can see, we did not call it directly on the user. We are sending it to another function. This one now is going to lose its context. And by the time we print this thing now, can you see what it's saying? Full name is undefined. Abi, first name is undefined, last name is undefined. Even though we are calling the function, but it's telling us that our first name is undefined, last name is undefined. And we know that it's not true. Here, first name is Faatihat here, last name is this. So how do we talk to this thing that we want anytime this thing is called here, we want to bind it, we want to bind the value of this. So what you can do here is just to do bind. And what are you binding it to? I'm binding it to user one. So which means by the time this thing enter here, when it's being called later on, the value of this inside this f is going to be the user. It doesn't do it for you. When you are passing your method around like this, anytime you pass the function around, it doesn't need to be method on this user. Don't even need to be here. So you can even define the stuff directly from here by just saying function my name like this. So this my name, what do we want to do here? So inside it, we want to return, or what you just want to do is to console log out. So let me just console log out the stuff. And what do we want to console log out there? We want to console log out my first name is, then this dot first name. But it doesn't need to be inside object alone. That's why I said it depending on who call it. Whoever call it will determine the value of this. So they don't need to be inside the object directly. And my last, so last name is, so this is going to be this, then last name like this. So what can we do here? What we can do now is to call this function. But we want to bind this function here into our object. So which object do you want to bind it to? You just mention the object, and that's the value of this is going to use. So just like the way we have this one, we can duplicate this line and disable this one. So instead of just doing this, so what I can just do here is remove this and call my name. So now if you save it, this one too is still going to give us the same problem. We're going to have my name is undefined and my last name is undefined, because where this my name is being called, look at it where it's being called. Is there any is there any object beside it before the dot? No. So since there is no object, or this one sef you cannot even call it with object because it's standing alone. But with the help of this bind now, we can talk to JavaScript that anytime this method is called, or anytime it is called, this is the object that you want to use as a value of this inside that method or inside the function. It doesn't need to be method. So anytime this thing is called, anytime this my name is called, so wherever you are using this there, it's going to revert to this user one. Even though it's not coming from user one, by the time we use it, as you can see, it's still working. So we get the correct stuff we're expecting, the first name and the last name, even though we did not define the stuff. But since we are binding it to this particular object, so the value of this inside it is going to revert to this whatever object that you pass into it. And this is the advanced stuff about this your function, because you can bind any object into it by talking to it that even though you are coming from here, we don't want it to be like that. You, anytime this is called inside you, this is the value you are going to use. But if you don't bind it, by default, it is going to use a this that is being called inside that function. For example, now, assuming the value of this here is something else, maybe it's object or it's any other thing that you call. Maybe and it's, let me just say name, or let me just say first name, like this is just test or any other thing that you want to do. So because this function later on, it can have its own context of this, and from there, you whatever function you call under it, they are going to take this up. But for now, I don't want to go into this because it's going to, yeah, it's going to give me this in. But inside the class later on, when we are dealing with stuff, you can do something like this. But any of your function that you want to call, wherever you are passing it, you need to bind it. But what if you don't want to bind it? You still want to be able to, where you are calling the function direct, where you want to call the function, that's where you want to do the binding. This is when we are sending the function down. We are not binding it. But where we want to call the function, we want to bind it to another function there. So there are different way of doing it. So where you are sending the function, if you want to bind, this is what you do. But where you are calling the function, if you want to bind it to another object, what you can do is to call this your function like this, and on it you can use call, then you pass whatever object that you want this thing to use, and whatever other stuff you want to pass into it is going to follow. So you can pass whatever argument you want like this, or instead of you doing it like this, you can use apply. Both of them are the same thing, but the difference between them is the way you pass the argument. So when you are dealing with this one, you pass the argument in the array. So instead of you binding it directly from here, when you are calling the function, you can actually do the stuff directly. So when you want to call this function now, you can call it like this, pass the object you want to use as this, and you pass whatever argument that that function is expecting. If there's any argument, if there's no argument, you forget about this one. Or you call it like this by using apply. Pass the object you want to use as this, and you use array to supply all the arguments to that function there. If you call it directly like this, to lose the context of whatever you are expecting it to have. But in order for you not to lose the context where you are calling it, what you can do, as you can see now, is undefined, undefined. But instead of us doing like this, you can just say call. So what are you calling this thing with? I'm calling it with user one. Is there any attribute that we need to, or is there any parameter we need to pass? I don't think we need to pass any parameter because this thing is not expecting anything from us. So we can just save it like this. Can you see that it's still working? So I did not bind it from where I'm sending it. I'm doing it directly from where the function is being called. So where the function is being called, you don't bind it from here. You can bind it where it's being used. It can work here too. So instead of you binding it like this, let me move this one down and comment out this one at the top. So instead of you binding it like this, you can actually do it on the line where it's being called. So most of the time you don't do all this thing, but when you are dealing with advanced JavaScript later on, you need them. But when you are reading some code, you are going to see them a lot. So here now, we can just pass the call, then pass the object you want to use as the value of this, and you supply the argument that you need to pass into the stuff. And it is still going to work like that. As you can see, it's going to work. As you can see, your level is 2, because that's what I pass as the value of this, and the language at the index 1, because I pass 1. If I pass 0 here as the argument, that's what is going to use as the argument, which is going to be y as a value. So you can call it directly. You can do it directly when you are calling the function, or you can bind it where you are doing the stuff. It all depends on which method you want to use. And each one of them have the time you'll be using it. But most of the time, bind is what you use when you want to assign it to another variable. Or if you don't have access, or if you can't bind it directly from here, you want it to happen when it's being called, or in that function, the person that will call it will be the one that will supply the object, then this is how it's going to be done. Or it can be like this. Instead of using call, what you can use is apply like this. So which is going to do the same thing. The difference between them is how you are passing the parameter. So when you are passing the argument to this one is just going to, you supply them. So argument 1, argument 2, argument 3, and so forth like that. But when you're dealing with this one, we are going to pass in a form of array. So argument one, argument two, argument three, depending on which method. Both of them will do the same thing. So you can call this one or this one. But the time you'll be doing all this thing is when you are using the value of this and you want the value to be whatever you're expecting it to be. Because when you started passing the function around as parameter to another function like this, it will lose the context of this. So if you don't want it to lose the content of this, you can assign whatever the value of this thing is going to be anywhere it is being called or where you are passing the stuff by using bind. If you do it like this, you are telling it that when this thing is being called later on, this is the object is going to use for the value of this. But if it is not, then it will assume the value of this based on where it's being called. If you don't do it, you don't do it, to do it for you, and the assumption might not be correct, because it will not give you what you are expecting. And the only time you'll be using this thing is when you want your method or whatever function you define to talk to a particular object, and it's going to operate on the data of that object there. And you always see this in a lot of JavaScript code base apart from React, or some React code base too, when you are dealing with class or you are creating a functionality with class outside of React and you cannot use inside React. You are going to use this because it is common to use this to access the object that you are creating from the class or the object that you actually created yourself, like this one. But when you are dealing with class, this object will be created later, it will be created later on. But how do you revert to that object? You are going to need the value of this, but this will be reverting to that whatever object that you create from the class there. And we're going to see all this in later on there when we get to that particular stuff. But before I call it a day, I need to explain this getter and setter here, which are really useful when you need to create a variable that are dynamic, or when you need to create a property that are dynamic, or you want to have some fine grain on how the value has been set inside your variable. So that's where this getter and setter comes in, which is something you can use on your object or on a class that we're going to be discussing about in the next class. So we are jumping into class in the next class. So here we have this setter function. They are function, but normally to the outside world, they are property. So to you that is defining it is a function, but to whoever is going to be using it is going to be a property. And they are really useful anytime you need to have kind of like power over how the value has been set or how people are accessing the value from your object or from the class that you have there, or the object you are going to be creating from the class. So for example here, we have this method here that is printing full name. But instead of me using method to access my full name, I can do the same thing by using this get method here, or the get uh accessor property here. So this get now, what you just need to do, mention whatever property you want. For example here is going to be full name, but the way you do it is just as if you are calling normal method, but it's to the user of the stuff, it's not, as you can see here. So get, so this is full name. It look like function, but it's not function. They are known as getter. So this is what we call getter, and the other one is setter, which is what we use to set. So now if you want to set full name, so you're going to see each one of them are in action, which I just need to console log out whatever you pass into it. So value. Well, where is this value coming from? It's whatever you pass to the stuff later on. Like so command is needed. So this is what we call the getter, and this is what we call the setter. So where you are defining them, it looks like function. But when you want to use them, you'll be using them as normal property. So here now, if I want to use the stuff, I will just use this user one, then full name directly, as if it's just a normal property on the object. So they are known as getter and setter. So when you are getting, like, this is what we call get. So this one now is going to call the get function. So anytime you access full name, so if I just console log out, you are just accessing the value. That's when it's going to call this your get here. So whatever you do inside, whatever you return from this get, that's what it's going to do. And as you can see, I'm not returning anything. That's why it's giving undefined. But here now, what I can do is just to return first. But now how do I have access to the first name? You can use what we talked about, which is this. Can you see now? This thing is now coming in. Because when you're dealing with all this getter and setter here, if you want to have access to that object, you need to use this to have access to whatever you want to use. But I will not do it like this. Let me use my backtick so that it's easier to work with. So this is going to be this dot first name like this, and comma, then this dot last name like this. So which means anytime you access this property inside this user one, this is what is going to return back to you. So this is known as getter method, and this is known as setter. So when you set a value for it, this is the one it will call. When you try to access the value, this is the one it will call. They are the same name, and the name are the same, but one is get, one is set, and the thing is not joining together. So when is it going to call this one, this get one? The time it's going to call it is when you are accessing the value. But when is it going to call this set? The time it's going to call the set is when you do it like this. So user one, then full name, like this is whatever you set. So my full name. So when you set a value like this to it, it will call this one here. And when you access the value like this, then it will call this function here. And they are referred to as getter and setter here. They are property too, but they are known as this accessor property because you used to access something inside this your object or to set. So you either get or you set. Whatever you return here doesn't need to match what is inside your object. Just return anything you want. But anytime this thing is called, this is what is going to return. Whatever you pass here is what is going to return. It doesn't need to relate to what is going on here. Whatever you return is what the user is going to get anytime they call it like this. And anytime they are setting, when they are using this operator with it, then this is the one is going to call. And whatever you pass in front of it, because you know that you can only pass one item. So whatever stuff you pass inside it, that's what is going to send as value. So now if I console log, if you save this in now, you see that the console that we're going to get on this line 65, which is this one. So whatever you send to it or whatever you assign to it, I whatever you assign to it, that's what this one will receive for this set, and it will perform whatever you want it to do. For example, here now, what I can do is just to set my so what I'm going to do is that first name, last name like this is going to be value then dot split, because I know that split, because I'm assuming that you are going to separate them by space. So the first one, don't forget, it's going to be array, and I'm structuring the value. So the first one to this, the second one to this. And what did I want to do? So this dot first name now is going to be this first name, and this dot last name is going to be whatever you pass here or whatever with the structure from the array that we have here. So now, instead of you setting the stuff from this your first name and last name, you can set it directly from full name. So which means my first name is going to be my, and my last name is going to be full name. And later on, when you access this one now, we should have a new value that we set. First, it is this Fatia Mohammed here. But now, after this line 99, the value should have changed to the new value. As you can see now, the value will change because we've updated the value here. And how is it possible? Because we are using this getter and setter here, because it allows you to kind of set a particular property, and you can use this thing to hide some functionality from the outside user. So here now, I can create a property here that it can only be seen inside this place. You can't see it outside because everything is visible outside here. I can still do user one dot first name. I will still be able to use it. But if I don't want this first name or last name to be available outside, it's something I can do. So what I can just do here, instead of defining them like this, comment them out. Then here, what we just want to do, return this first name and last name. If they are not set by default, just return empty string for this one. You cannot find this one too, so that we know that it's not just returning undefined, undefined. So this is what is going to return by default. But once it's set, you see that everything will still work the way. What did I have? Where do I have error? Ah, oh, what am I doing here? So save it and run the stuff. And as you can see, the first time we don't have anything, but the next time now that we set the value, we are getting the stuff. So the outside user of this function, they don't know about first name, They don't know about last name. The only thing they will have access to is full name. If you come here now and check, if you do user one, then dot now, you see that there is nothing like first name, there is nothing like last name again. So you've hidden the functionality from the user. The only thing the user will focus on is this outer one that they are going to be using. But nothing concern them about this first name and nothing concern them about last name. But JavaScript, you see that it's still working. Even though I set this in and it's not on this object, once you use this, it's going to set it because behind the scene, this is just referring to the object. And why is it working? Is because we are calling this in on the object. You know, if you assign it to another variable, you'll get something else. So that's why you need to know how this work, where it can be called, where it cannot be called, or whenever it's being called. If you want to change the value of this, you can bind, or you can use call, or you can use apply for the stuff. And this is what I'll be stopping today. In the next class here, we're going into the class, which is a more robust way of you creating your object. Because right now, we have this our object for a particular user. What if you only need like 10 users? Are you now going to be duplicating this code for the same functionality that is here? No. What do? You create a blueprint, which is class. So from that blueprint now, you start generating any object that you want outside of it. Instead of you creating your object directly like this, you create the blueprint like, okay, any object later on that I want to create, oh, you are going to get this full name, you are going to have this set full name, you are going to have this method, it's going to have this print full name, and so forth like that. So, and from that blueprint now, you can now generate any object you want out of it. And that's what we're going to be doing in the next class by talking about this constructor, the member, which is what I'm using here. As you can see here, is what I'm using here to abstract out this storage service. So later on now, where this thing is being used, if I later decide, okay, I don't want to use local storage and this type of storage again, though, this is where I will just change the code. I don't need to start looking for anywhere I'm using this thing. This is the only place that will just make the changes. And wherever I'm using it, everything will still work the way it's supposed to work. Because here, I've created a system. And inside that system, the only thing I'm exposing out is what you can use. There's nothing concerning you about what is going on with the storage that I'm using behind the scene. But your own is that you can save the data where you want the data to be. You don't need to care about how the data is being saved. So this is where everything is happening. But the color of this stuff here doesn't need to care. The only thing they will just be called is get item or set item or clear. But you don't know where it's clearing the stuff from or what is the code is being used to clear it. Nothing concerning you. So you are going to be doing something like this to create a manageable code rather than you just bombarding everything inside your component. And when anytime you need something like that, you do copy and paste, and in case you now need to change something, or later on you guys now decide, oh, this is not what you want to do, you don't want to use local storage again, you now want to be using some external storage, or you want to be saving in database. That means wherever you are using this thing, you have to go there and start modifying everything. And you know, when you're working with a large project, there's no way you want to be doing something like that. So what do? You create a class, and out of that class, or you create a functionality or a system around class for that your particular functionality. And anytime you need that stuff, you create object or you create instance of that class and you use it there. And anytime something change, the internal implementation, you don't need to, like, the user of the stuff doesn't need to care about it. The person that's implementing stuff, that's what the person will just take care of, and you don't need to care about the other stuff. Yeah, and as you can see from here, which is something you can use later on when you are dealing with class here. For example, like this stuff here, you can see we have a class, which is really powerful because later on here you are defining how things are going to come in and how they are going to go out. And anytime something change, you don't need to start going to all your component where you use the stuff. You only do the changes here, and from that place you see everything instantly. And if you look at all this in, this is something that is going to be used in React. As you can see, is this is hook here, but this hook now is using a class functionality here, where you have your class that has been created here. But what is it doing here? It's using something known as later on, we're going to talk about it, which is the static method. Because what he's doing here, where is this thing being instantiated? I did not know. But he's using this add one. But what is this add one here? How is it possible that you are calling add one on the class that you've not created yet? You've not created any object out of this class, but you are calling this add one directly. What is going on here is known as static. But it's not even talking about it. But once we talk about this class and we talk about the static variable, static method, private, and all those things, Then you are going to see the stuff later. And as you can see, this is the static one here. But if you look at this one is not static because you have to instantiate the object before you start using the stuff. And as you can see, this is React application, but it's using all the stuff that we're going to be talking about in the next class here, because that's what you always, as you can see, class API. Instead of you defining everything directly in your component, you abstract it out in case this thing change later on, or maybe the backend you are using or some URL that you are using change. You only go to where you define them and you make the changes here, but your application will still be working because you still want to add one, but the URL has changed. But you don't need to start looking for where you've used this URL. You only come to this place because this is where all the functionality are. But those places that where you're using them, they are calling the stuff. And as you can see here, before even getting that, I already know they're static. Why? Because of the way it's calling the stuff here. And once we talk about all these things in the next class, then all these things too will look uh normal to you there like that. So this is where we'll stop. Let me quickly upload the video so that you can have access to that stuff. Any question? Cheese, 1 hour, 20 minutes. Stop.